Hey guys, thank you for joining me at Completing Christ as we continue this journey through the book of Jonah. I don't know about you, but God's really speaking to my heart through this little book. We made it to the end of chapter 1, where Jonah had told the sailors if they would throw him overboard, that the sea would calm, and the last verse would become calm. And the last verse in chapter 1 says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of a fish for 3 days and for 3 nights." That's where we ended off, that they threw Jonah overboard, that God appointed a fish that he had already made to go and to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of a fish for 3 days and for 3 nights. And then in chapter 2, he starts this prayer, and we're going to spend the next few weeks looking just at the first couple of verses of this prayer. In chapter 2, it says this: "Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the stomach of a fish." It says that verse 17 tells us that Jonah's in the belly of a fish. They throw him overboard. The fish swallows him. He spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish. Chapter 2 starts with, "Then he prayed." Then Jonah prayed to his God. After 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, then he finally prayed. You got to remember that when you're reading this, that Jonah wrote this after the event. He's remembering back to what had happened. He's remembering back and thinking through, what happened to him when he chose to disobey God and to run from the presence of the Lord. And he knows exactly how long he was in the belly of a fish. And it says, after 3 days and 3 nights, he then prayed. Think about what all Jonah had been through. That God had spoken to him clearly, told him he wanted to go to Nineveh, but Jonah didn't want to go. So he goes to Tarshish, he buys a ticket, gets on the boat going in the opposite direction. He ran into a God-hurled storm. Storm was so severe that the boat began to crack up. The sailors thought they were going to die. They throw their cargo overboard. They end up casting lots, and the lot fell on Jonah, and Jonah finally admitted the storm was his fault. So they come up with all these options. The sailors said, "Man, we can row this thing back to shore," and they couldn't. And Jonah finally said, "Just throw me overboard." Jonah had been through a lot before he ever got to the belly of a fish. But from the belly of the fish, he cries out to God. Have you ever thought, why did it take Jonah so long before he finally cried out to God, before he finally prayed, before he finally began to understand what his disobedience was costing him? But in his desperation, he finally calls out unto the Lord. I find that oftentimes in our life that we do the exact same thing. That it takes a lot sometimes before we finally do what we should have already done. As you think about prayer and the importance of prayer and crying out to the Lord, that oftentimes it takes circumstances and events in our life to get us to the point of desperation before we finally bow and we finally cry out to God. The thing that we should have done first, often it takes a lot before we ever do what should be a natural response as a believer. But why does it take us so long? What are some of the reasons why we often delay crying out unto the Lord? I thought about 3 or 4 that I want to share with you as we wind down today's video. The first thing is that sin or disobedience will cause me to wait. When I'm living in sin or I am living in disobedience, I'm running from the presence of the Lord. The last thing I want to do is to cry out and to come back into His presence. I've noticed in my own life times when that I kind of moved away from the Lord, that I didn't even want to be around God's people. I didn't want to be around people who I knew were walking with the Lord, because I was afraid they were going to call me out. They were going to sense something in my life that was not right, and they may say something to me. So sin will cause us not to do what we need to do. Another thing I thought about was that oftentimes we think we can fix the problem. We think that we can handle it. We don't think that we need God. We don't think we need to cry out. I can handle this. I can fix this problem on my own, when what I really need to do is to cry out to the maker of heaven and earth. And also I thought about sometimes it's just a lack of trust, not believing that God can, or maybe more in our cases is believing that God won't, that He can, but He wouldn't do that for me. He may answer somebody else. He may respond to somebody else's cry, but He probably is not going to respond to mine like He would theirs. And then the last thing I thought about is that oftentimes, and I mentioned this before, oftentimes we have to get to the point of desperation before we ever cry out. That everything else has to fail. You realize that's what happened in Jonah's life? Everything that they came up with, everything that Jonah came up with, everything that the sailors came up with, they all failed. Because to get Jonah to the point of desperation, God knew exactly what was going to have to happen. And for Jonah, it was in the belly of a fish for 3 days and for 3 nights. So when I have disobeyed God, what do I need to do? I need to cry out. I need to cry out. And I need to remember why I have the privilege to cry out to the God that made, as Jonah said in chapter 1, the God that made the sea and the heavens and the dry land. We need to cry out to Him. I thought about a passage as I was going back over this today, as I was reviewing back over this today. I thought about a passage in the book of Hebrews that just reminds us of what an awesome privilege that we have to come into the presence of a holy God because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. In Hebrews chapter 4, I want to read you verses 14 through 16 as we close out today. Listen to what it says now. The writer of Hebrews often uses Old Testament terminology because the people understood it. Verse 14 of chapter 4 says this: Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. They understood what a high priest was. High priest was a go-between. Jesus is our go-between. Between us and a holy Father, a holy God. Verse 15 says this: We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. You see, Jesus understands when we make wrong choices, when we're tempted. Jesus understands that. He understands our weaknesses. We have a high priest who sympathizes with us. We need to run to Him, not run from Him. And verse 16 says this, Therefore let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace. Let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Man, I often think of that verse. To me, it says, look, God says, look, I know you're going to need grace. I know you're going to need mercy. I got it. Come get it. Come into my presence. Come get it. That my prayer for you and for me is this: man, we would hold on to Jesus, we would cry out to Jesus, and we would lean in close to the Father because of what Jesus has done for us on the cross. Man, let's learn a valuable lesson from Jonah. Don't let prayer be our last resort. Man, when we mess up, let's be willing to run to the Father. Or He may have a fish with our name on it. I pray that you'll lean in close, you'll hang on close to Jesus, and you'll cry out to the Father. What a privilege we have to come into the presence of a holy God because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. Let's take advantage of it. Have a blessed day. Let Jesus be Jesus in you today. Thank you so much for watching Complete in Christ as we strive to teach you about the Christ life. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and may you have a blessed day walking with Jesus.